original short story by Rebecca Black entitled How Shall We Fix It, from a collection of short stories entitled The Women in the Village. Once upon a time, when all the women lived together in the village and no one lived anywhere else, there was a young, poor woman who could not bear to throw away anything that was broken. When her favorite bowl broke, she mended it with new clay so cleverly and fired it so well that it became as smooth as it had been before it was broken. When her broom began to fray, she wove in bits of straw until it became as strong and sturdy a broom as it had been when it was new. Soon, her reputation as a mender and fixer spread out from her circle of friends. People from far and wide began to bring their broken things to the woman to be mended. They began to bring very difficult broken things to the woman for her mending touch. One brought a rake missing all its teeth. Then another brought a fractured toy. Still another came to her, bearing the many pieces of a shattered hoe. All of these she mended and more. With cleverness she worked her magic, fixing and repairing, drawing broken, unuseful things back to their original purposes. One hot day, a woman unknown to the village appeared, walking slowly down the street. She carried in a pack on her back something large and heavy, and as she walked, all could see the strain of it in her face. She came to the house of the woman who mended and wearily sat down. Moving carefully, she spread open the cloth of her pack. The women who were gathered nearby hurried to her side, for in the pack they could see a young child whose arm was at a strange angle. The child's face was grim and pale, and clearly he was in great pain. The woman who could fix anything cried aloud to see the poor child's broken and twisted arm. Wringing her hands, she said to herself in despair, "Oh, how shall I fix it, my dear?" For it had been her secret worry that someday she would be called upon to mend a living person. In her heart, she knew both dread and fear, for the skin and bone of a person could not be rewoven or pasted or reground to make new again. Carefully laying her hands upon the child, she felt the break. She was relieved to feel the bone edges lying clean and sharp and close to one another, and that the skin was not broken. Sparing a glance at the agonized mother, she laid her hand upon the child's face and spoke to him calmly. "This will hurt," she told him. "I must pull the bones apart in order to put them in the right place again." The child, though clearly exhausted and in pain, looked at her with large, trusting eyes and nodded. Taking hold of the child's arm, she positioned her body and then pulled with all her might. The ends of the bones shifted past one another and then settled back into their rightful place. The child screamed once and then bit his lip, sweating and pale. The woman ran her hand tenderly over the mended arm. It would take time for the bones to grow together once again, but she could see they were aligned and true. Taking some cloth, she made a sling to support the injured arm. Some of the women nearby came forward to offer housing and food for the exhausted mother and child, and they were led away. The woman who could mend anything went alone to sit and cry under a tree. Soon, 2 or 3 of the women of the village came to sit with her. They knew she was weeping tears of joy at being able to help the suffering child. The next day, the woman and child returned to their home. The child grew strong and became a carpenter like his father, using his mended arm to hammer as if it had always been whole and unbroken. Many years later, the woman who could mend anything was sitting by her door, enjoying the cool breeze of the evening. A party was in full uproar in her house, for her son and new daughter-in-law had just been wed. Many more guests had come than had been expected, and while she sat in the cool, her mind worried a little about the party. She would be ashamed if guests had to be turned away, for her resourceful and thrifty ways had resulted in a generous abundance and a heart to share it with all. As she sat there, she heard some newcomers arrive, a mother and her grown son. She heard the steward of the feast whisper to a woman from the village that they were nearly out of wine. Looking toward the tall urns of water the woman of the village had helped her draw over days from the well, she wondered how she might fix this for her beloved son. As she mused, the steward passed her again with a full skin of wine. She heard some newcomers praise her son for his good wine, and she relaxed. The woman who could mend anything was content that all in her house were happy and having a good time. Several years passed from that day, and the women in the village began to see signs that spring was approaching. One of them, having tended as best she could to her garden during the fallow time, was overjoyed to see shoots coming up from the ground. Carefully covering them with hay, lest they freeze should the weather turn cold again, she began to dream of meals to come and the beautiful dress she would buy herself once she could harvest and sell a little of her produce. The next morning, she hurried back to take another look at the new green and growing sprouts. To her dismay, the new green had disappeared under muddy hoofprints and the track of a heavy cart. Casting her mind around to think who might have trampled on her budding crop, she found herself staring at the house of her best friend. With a furious heart, she marched to the door and pounded on it. As her friend came to the door, she began to shout angrily. Her dearest friend was at first shocked and then began to defend herself. "Who among us women could have known that you had decided to grow upon that spot?" the friend demanded. "But you have ruined what I planned so carefully," said the woman, remembering only her grievance and not the many years of friendship between them. The friend closed the door. Angrily, the aggrieved woman hastened to find a few other women to come back with her and present her case on the doorstep of her once best friend. Though several women pleaded with the stubborn friend, she refused to admit her wrongdoing. All through the next day and the next, the woman whose garden had been trampled nursed her grievance, and her resentment grew more swiftly than had even the green shoots she so happily hailed a few days before. Gathering the community of women in the village, she presented her case against her friend. Meanwhile, one of the wisest women in the village, one who had traveled far and done much, began to speak to the women in the village, recalling the words of one whom she had met in her travels. "Truly, he told us to love one another," she told the women, "and that none should stand against another." The women were impressed. "What would he have said about this warring women?" they asked. She thought for a moment and then said, "When anyone who was broken came to us, he would not ask us to condemn or judge, but he would say, 'How shall I fix it, my dear?' Once he said to us, 'If another woman in a village sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone, and if she listens to you, you've not lost that friend. But If you're not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if the woman refuses to listen to your friends, go tell it to all the gathered community. And if she refuses to listen even to the gathering, let such a one be to you as an outcast." At this, the body of women murmured, for they had tender hearts. "Must we turn our hearts away? Must we cast out one we love simply for her prideful ways?" they cried out. By this time, the friend who had trampled the garden had begun to regret the angry words she and her friend had exchanged. Coming into the midst of the gathered women, she began to make her apology to the friend she loved, telling of her regret for her prideful refusal to make amends. But the aggrieved woman was too angry to hear her. Feeling betrayed, she closed her heart and her ears and began to speak ill words of her former friend. Bitterly helpless, the erring friend cried aloud, "Can we not fix this, my dear?" Now, I have heard tell from the women in the village that on that day the women became divided, and some took one side and some took another. And as they spoke to one another in anger and in fear, one of the mothers stood up and told them a story. How in this very village there once lived an old woman who could mend anything that was broken. With swift and cunning fingers, she had built for herself a reputation as one who could mend and repair all things. As she aged, her son, who had been fortunate by marriage, arranged that her clever fingers might find a new outlet. Her love of form and shape led her to sculpt objects out of clay. As she grew more adept at this craft, other women of the village came to admire what she had created. The old woman began then to love her objects, calling them her children and investing all the love she had in her in each one. Every day she would take out her objects and lovingly dust the fragments of dirt and leaves and feathers that might have drifted upon them in the night. Other women began to discuss and marvel at her devotion to the objects. As her love for them grew, she became jealous of those who came to look upon them. She made the other women stand back and not approach too closely, for fear they might break one of her precious objects. Each object became to her as if they were her own very heart. One day, as the old woman sat in the sun crafting from clay, making a representation of the beauty of the face of a friend's child, the baby, just learning to walk, fell upon and broke one of her beautiful creations. The mother of the baby snatched up her child, fearful of her friend's reaction, knowing the love the old woman invested in each precious piece. The mother and the baby began to cry together, mourning the loss of beauty, mourning the grief they were prepared to see in the old woman, mourning what they were sure was the end of a friendship. The old woman stood up slowly, dusting herself off, while her face worked, holding back tears. Then, with her eyes shining and full, with tears threatening to overflow, with grief and pain and anger and love playing on her face, she turned to the mother. She held out her arms. Fearfully, the mother placed her baby into the old woman's arms. Tearfully, the two women looked into each other's faces. The old woman, with a quiver in her voice, said to her friend, "That which is broken, that cannot be repaired. But let the love between us not be broken. For if it is, how shall we fix it, my dear?" Trusting in the love of friend for friend, the women held each other and wept for the loss of beauty and for the precious finding anew of their love for one another. When she had finished her story, all the women sat for a moment in silence. Quietly, in pairs and groups, they stood to embrace one another. The erring friend who had trampled upon the green and the aggrieved woman who had lost her garden were the last to leave. Pulling from her pocket a beautiful clay figure of herself as a baby, the aggrieved woman smiled at her dearest friend and took her hand. "How shall we fix it, my dear?" And they walked away together hand in hand. The bonds of love had brought them back into union, one with the other. All this happened when the women lived in the village and no one lived anywhere else.